The power of audio is its fantasy basis and its capacity to kind of bring us into our own imaginations and other people's projections into our imaginations. So you arrive, you walk through a beautiful but kind of old garden that was planted in 1967 and is still as it was. You walk to the second floor, there's a door, there's no name on the door. And you enter into a space that is very, I think, unusually composed. Black Hole is a space for listening. It is also a place where I work as an artist. It's a place where other people make work as artists. It's also a place where people can think about what audio technology is and how it's affecting our daily lives, the culture in general. I think Black Hole is an extension of the feeling that there was no place for the experiences that I was interested in having, and that there needed to be a new kind of place that would put the audience or the listener at the center of an experience. I think Black Hole is a model for a sustainable space for a particular layer of cultural production. There's a number of programs that Black Hole operates, and the main one is just called sessions. The idea is that when a session opens, it doesn't close, and that it's instantiated by the user. You can make a reservation online to come to this location in Gardena. The flooring here is like a perforated rubber, sort of like a lightweight gym floor with acoustically absorptive material underneath. The walls are also blacked out. There's speakers everywhere, though you might not see them because most of them are pretty small. But at the moment, it's sort of like a 18-channel sound system in a relatively small space. There's an array kind of at foot level, there's an array at ear level, there's an array at ceiling level, and those are run through a software that is taking into account the geometry of the space. And there's a number of different ways that you can then kind of calculate sending sound to a combination of those speakers so that it feels relatively like a seamless surface. There are also pieces that happen here that are intended to identify sounds with a very particular location, which don't, get processed in that way. You'll have the experience of whatever that piece is for whatever duration the author has decided that should be. We have one piece now, which is Catherine Christer Hennick's, has a piece called Solitone Star. The audio materials are just a few milliseconds long, but it loops endlessly, and to understand it, she thinks it takes 3 hours. So the session is 3 hours. We have other pieces where the piece is 70 minutes and you come here for 70 minutes. Sometimes the piece is playing when you get here, sometimes it's not. I think the experience of coming to this room is that depending upon the piece, you might feel like the room is pretty small, or you might feel it's kind of floating or big. The impression of the room is really altered by the piece, but it's also intentionally not a perfectly acoustically treated space. You still will know that you're in the world. It's not about it being a complete virtualization outside of time and space. It's not exactly a black hole. You can kind of still have the feeling that you are in Gardena, you're on Redondo Beach Boulevard. The power of audio is its fantasy basis and its capacity to kind of bring us into our own imaginations. I think you feel that most clearly when you have some kind of friction. There's an environment here that is not neutral. It's not like a perfect sound. It's not obviously like a visually neutral place. Black Hole defines its own terms for what your expectations can be for the kind of experience you would have of one of these works. Los Angeles is a funny city because it's an incredibly vast, sprawling, decentered environment. And I think that's what people love about it, is that there's many, many centers. Gardena is interesting because it's neither South Bay, nor is it South Central, nor is it really East LA. It's kind of unclear exactly how to identify it. And it has an extremely complex, dynamic history from the fact that it was believed to be the next Las Vegas. So we still have several Larry Flynn casinos down the street. Before that, it was, before internment in World War II, there was a lot of Japanese strawberry farms. It's the center of Japanese American life in Los Angeles historically. How culture makers use Los Angeles is to not use most of it. People should be using and investing in communities where they live and not all living in the same place. And to me, that's what makes Los Angeles a worthwhile model of like a futuristic city, which is like the extreme pluralism of it. And that's currently not really the case in terms of art context, music context. We were ready to open the space to the public on April 1st of 2020, which was the worst time in any of our lives to create a public space. As part of that and as part of the protests that were happening last summer, we deinstalled part of the system and basically built it into a bike, which was volunteered for protests and other events during that time, and basically still available on request.
2, 3, testing.
So we called that LA Audio Solidarity. After getting more involved with some community groups here, like the local neighborhood council, I began to understand that development activities in Los Angeles, the gears of those are largely quantitative in terms of various studies and ways of challenging development projects. But one of the main ways that you can engage with development projects like this that affect things like air quality is through noise, because it's very difficult to quantify the environmental impact of these things ahead of time. The idea came that, the issue is that if you want to hire a noise consultant, most of these consultancies are primarily hired by developers. We have the equipment and the skills to do these services, and so that also is basically, as it can be useful to like a neighborhood council or a community group, we'll go and make measurements for free and write reports and that kind of thing. But it's definitely something in Los Angeles that's really needed to effectively challenge development, particularly in these areas where the communities by design don't have a voice with the city council. My own practice has morphed a lot. Like I definitely started as a musician. As you're learning what life is about, of all the things that you can do, it seemed like making music was the most whole, complete, and challenging activity that I knew of. I started to find that being a performer and spectating in performance was largely disempowering for the audience, and that the whole kind of like cultural rubric is that you are there to behold majesty and skill sets that you can't possibly have. And just as like a cultural force, that seems like pretty retrograde to me. And so I think that's how I ended up thinking more of sound installation. So I started making more like audio-based sound sculptures. And then after doing a few of those in museums and starting to understand that the way of listening that you can move yourself into as an author of such things is too much to ask of someone who has 10 or 15 minutes in a museum. And that has a lot to do with that. We're actually such trained listeners through popular music that people are listening through this framework of like, is it music, is it not music? And there's no way to kind of bring people into some other whole idea of listening in that setting. And so my work modulated more towards thinking about structuring attention in time, or puts the perceiver in a space where no one is an expert. So I started making a series of pieces called air rooms. Basically, there was like MIDI control over lots of fans and air movement. And the dream was always to make those actually silent, that you could be in a space just kind of moving your attention as this kind of dynamic of airflow was around you, which is still yet to be fully realized, I would say. 2011, 2012, I think I was consolidating a lot of my thoughts and feelings over the previous decade. One of those things was a book that I wrote called Figures in Air, and the other is this diagram, which was generated as part of some other pieces, which were, there was a few installations that were like circular reading rooms with lots of diagrams and images. And I kind of initiated a diagramming practice as some other way of thinking, or also some other way of composing. And there was one diagram which is kind of like the master diagram for that whole phase. And a black hole that consumes all doubt plays a key position within that diagram. There's a spectrum of certainty and doubt in all of our lives, both as people who make things, but also just as humans operating as decision makers and improvisers in our lives. I'm always resorting to feeling that the point of existence is to find more awareness of more possibilities and more alternatives. And that's what consciousness would be. And that to consume all of your doubt and all of your questions is kind of like some weird short circuit, black hole tunnel. At the same time, I have too much doubt and I could really use a black hole to throw a lot of it into. So I think it became some kind of spiritual object for me. At the same time, some kind of metaphor for how I was thinking about audio, which is that thinking about audio as not only a technology of representation that has kind of bypassed our kind of Turing tests for what it's capable of doing. So we use audio as if it's capable of transmitting an essence or a reel from a microphone through all kinds of transformations to a record. And then, we're playing a John Coltrane LP and we think like we're experiencing these feelings from another time and place and person. And of course we do have those feelings. And so the question is why? And I think, for me, where I've kind of ended up is that audio has been since the beginning a kind of sleeper form of AI almost, or we treat it as if it's the way that we can transport other intelligence and feelings and humanity into the present. And when we do that, we're going into a black hole that consumes all doubt in order to kind of enter into this kind of fantasy space. It's taken on a lot of valiance in this space that's called black hole. That's what it's called like in the world. When you get here, all of the materials around it are a black hole that consumes all doubt. So this space is also somehow a black hole that consumes all doubt.